Hello and welcome back to our workshops on the Bach cello suites on Adagio Live. This will be my last episode of 2020. Oh, will you excuse me? I have a little technical thing I forgot to put the original sound. Here we are, now we can really go. So this is going to be the last episode of 2020. And I want to thank you all for this journey, which started, well, as a little positive outcome of the terrible time we go through. I had been thinking about doing some pedagogical work on the Bach suite, to do it online, and for many years, but I had pushed it back because of lack of time, because also maybe I was a bit intimidated, and I was looking for a certain kind of perfection. And in this context that we have had since the beginning of the year, I think all of us, or most of us, we have had a little bit of a push. We have been encouraged to go into the cold water and just do whatever we can do with the means, my living room, and somehow it's been very wonderful to welcome you in my place like this at quite regular intervals, not always so regular. But anyways, today for this last episode, Allemande from the Fifth Suite, and my guest will be the absolutely marvelous Kristian Bezuidenhout. And he will tell us why he likes this Allemande from the Fifth Suite so much, particularly, because I can already tell you that most of my guests, they don't really say that I want to come for this movement or this movement. And we started to talk because I wanted to have Chris on this series. So I started to harass him a long time ago. And he immediately told me, I would so much love to come for the Allemande of the Fifth Suite. So we will ask him why this movement is so dear to him and why he likes it so much. Before we go on to our Allemande, I have a little catch-up work to do. I received, before the last episode, a question by Jeffrey Wang, who has been very assiduous in following this series. And Jeffrey had asked me a question about the prelude, about the tempo relation between the first part of the prelude and the fugue. And I didn't have time to go at it because if you remember, I got a bit passionate about this prelude and I spent too much time on it, and I wanted to have time with our guest Christoph Wolf, and it was really worth it to have this time with him. So anyway, when I arrived at the end of the prelude, I didn't have time to address this question. I will do this quickly now. So let me read the question by Jeffrey. Holidays greeting, Jean-Guihen. Thank you so much, dear Jeffrey. Yeah, you know what? I think I will read this first sentence, which is so nice. And yeah, it makes me happy. So I just read it to you. I've enjoyed every episode along your Bach journey and appreciate every bit of wisdom and advice you have shared. So thank you so much, dear Jeffrey. Now to the question. Hopefully there is still time for me to ask a question about C minor prelude. I have always wondered about the tempo relation between the opening versus the fugue. At the meter change, it's interesting to note in the Paris first edition the wording allegro moderato, and also in the lute version, in Bach's own hand, très vite. What do you make of these hints, and how should the cellist present this transition? So thank you so much for this wonderful question. There are quite a few questions in there, actually, in fact. And I would start with the Paris edition with the allegro moderato. I went at this topic already quite a few episodes ago, but I want to say it again. I personally find that these tempo indications, particularly this combination of allegro moderato, that's already a little bit of how could I say, something that, some layer that is starting to add up on the language of Bach, which doesn't belong to it. So I personally would not give too much attention to that. I would consciously ignore it. That's my opinion. Then, of course, by the hand of Bach, très vite, written at the beginning of the fugue in the lute version. Well, this, of course, is a very interesting indication. I think it's also interesting to think of it in the relation to the lute, where there are many little chords that are added as a, compared to the cello version, where anyway you will be dragged back a little bit, and also because a plucked instrument will tend to play this kind of note, definitely not as fast as the cello. So I would only make relative this tempo indication by the fact that it's written for an instrument which by nature would tend to play it slower than the cello would. And then the beginning of your question is about the relation of tempo between the introduction and the fugue. Now, I will tell you my personal subjective philosophy about this. I like to have I like to think of the relation of tempo, but I also like each tempo to have its organic truth. So let me explain myself. If we talked about this, about the punctuation in the introduction that have a certain kind of tempo that makes sense. So I think there is this thing here. If I try to think of a tempo relation, if I want to have a tempo relation which is really exact, the only option would be so I don't say it's impossible. I even sort of like it, but considering what's happening later in this fugue, with certain of the modulations, certain of the double stops, certain of the strong harmonic turns happening, I would not be too eager to have exactly the same pulse. I think that's where it comes, that I think each of these tempos has to have its own logic and a pulse that really makes sense. So I would do it this kind of relation, but a bit slower. So sorry for taking some time for this. Let's go to our Allemande. Well, our Allemande, interestingly, starts also with this French style punctuations. We talked about the ouverture à la française, and here we are again with dotted rhythms. And so definitely Bach goes for this French style in this beginning of this suite, with the introduction and with this Allemande. And this is also something I will want to ask Kristian about, what his thoughts on this later on. Now, I will start with a little tip to our cellist friends out there, because I just had a lesson on this piece just this week with my student Ulker, and she had struggled after the big chords to how to go on after the big chords. So very often we get stuck at the tip of the bow, and then we want to come back to be at the right place in the bow. And this is one of the things that gets us often a little bit stuck, because then the chord stands by itself. I exaggerate, and then the music gets cut. Whereas obviously we want to come out of the long note with the small note in a very organic way. So I think the solution is to not be worried about the place of the bow. Stay where you are, because after this, once the dotted rhythm starts, you will anyway want to articulate and want to have air, or as my last teacher, Tim Eddy, taught me one day, and I thought it was very interesting. The dot of the note has to breathe. So one more thing I want to say about this beginning, and then we actually go into how this piece is constructed, is the upbeat. The upbeats before big chords are also often a struggle for us cellists, because we want to have this continuation of the upbeat and the main note on the downbeat, and very often we tend to we try to rush to do the chord. Now, this is the mistake, and this is where again Arno Bilsma is helping us. He suggested the upbeat is an invitation. Don't try to set a tempo. Don't try to be don't try to give a tempo. Just invite us into the first chord, and then do your arpeggiando of your chord. Don't start with double stop down there. Start only with the C string, and then you will be able to go on. Here a little observation. A flat, like in Anna Magdalena's manuscript, not the A natural, which is in too many editions, unfortunately. So we start our modulations to go to first. We start by going to A flat major, and then F minor. Now we start first an improvisation that brings us to E flat major, where we will stay for a while. So an extensive section of 4 bars were in E flat major, and now that's where there is a point that I want to make. That so this seems to be, our piece in C minor. That's our main key. So we expect to be at the end of this section either most probably in the dominant. We will finish this first section in the dominant, which would be G major, or the relative key, which is E flat major. And he just now gave a lot of importance to E flat major. So we sort of expect that after this there will be maybe a little bit again of something, but this will be our main key for the first part. So let me play that again. He's really celebrating this key in a very lyrical way. But he brought us back to C minor, which is something he does most of the time, that before finishing a section, he comes shortly back home saying, C minor, we know that's our home. And then in the moment we expect him to just finish in E flat major, he puts a sort of what I call a little prayer that leads us, that puts all this in question and brings us into G minor. And then we finish in G minor. And the tierce Picard at the end, the B natural, which will also make it easier for us to come back to C minor. But see, that's something I find interesting. I don't know if you remember in the prelude of the fourth suite, he also did something a bit similar, where in this E flat major suite, in the prelude, there was this very, very, very long section in G minor, and with only minor key minor key, and only in the last minute we make our way back to our actual key of E flat major. Here it's not as extensive, but it's a little bit the same idea. He starts the second half with our motive in a different key, in a different. I want to say a little something here about he's working on the voices to create what I call lyricism. I would be interested to see what Chris will tell us about this. But as you see, this is our bass line. This is our lower line. And by the way, to those of you cellists out there, make sure that when you get there, play this E flat, having this this line, this bass line that will go on later on, have it already in mind and in your soul, so that you will play that this is going to be your bass line. Because then when you add the other voices, then you fully realize how expressive and generous they are. Now again in a bit a similar way as in the first part, he brings us back to E flat major. Remember, which was this big chunk of E flat major we had in the first part. Well, he brings it back here with a sort of bass solo. Wonderful dissonance. And then remember how in the first part, he, after this section in E flat major, he put everything in question with one little motive that brought us to G minor. Well, here he does in a way a similar thing. So he seems to have an issue with E flat major in this suite, but he does it in a much more surprising and in a way shocking way. It's one of these systemic moments. With this D flat at the moment where we expect anything but that, and then we are left there and saying, okay, what's this? So we could be in E flat major, but in A flat major. No, it's F minor. Which again, on the moment of the resolution of the cadenza, is questioned by the A natural. We are back home in C minor. With very expressive, you see, gestures and dialogue between voices which are for the our instrument quite spread out. supplication maybe, and then a reflection on it, which is a sort of kind of improvisation. Sorry for talking so much, but I wanted to share with you some ideas and why, in my view, this Allemande is so gorgeous. This is now the time to have our guest, Kristian Bezuidenhout, join us. Dear Chris, are you there? Can you hear me? Are you with us? I will put this a bit in a better position. Dear Chris, can you hear me? Yes. Hello. Dear Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It's absolutely fantastic. So I will go straight to the question that has been going through my head in the last months already, since we have been talking about your coming here. What's so special about this Allemande?
How much time do we have, Jean-Guihen? Just so I know. Just so
yes. We have a good 20 minutes.
Okay, fine, good.
20 minutes.
Gosh, I mean, so many of the things that you've just brought up in that little 20-minute expose, exactly how I feel about the piece. Where to begin? This is such a remarkable suite for so many reasons. This is also such a remarkable movement, because I think one of the things that's always drawn me to this particular suite, the C minor, particularly the first two movements, well, the first three really, is this unbelievable saturation of kind of French style that is so prevalent in this piece. You know, we read liner notes for these suites and we get to the sixth and people always say, of course, the French overture, the French style. But the reason why I wanted to join you for this piece particularly is I'd like to talk more specifically, kind of nuts and bolts, about what I believe that means in Bach's mind, what he's evoking, what he's hoping to embody, portray with the choice of key, with the use of the solo instrument, but then conversely, the very specific narrative that he's mapping onto this piece with the use of these dotted rhythms, and particularly what the placement of this Allemande means in the course of the six, and how it differs, I think, so dramatically from the other Allemandes in the six suites. So I don't know, I think maybe you should ask me questions, or I could just talk about what I think is happening here historically in a movement like this. But do you...
I would love you to just go at it.
Okay.
I'm ready to just
listen. God. Look, where to begin? You know, sort of 20, 30 years ago, there was this massive controversy about what it means to say that there's French influence in Bach. We understand, kind of historically speaking, that Bach is coming at a time and is sort of remarkable in the way that he can combine sort of the hyper energetic Italianate virtuosity and kind of extremity of the world of Vivaldi that was super prevalent at this time. I mean, Vivaldi was a hugely published composer and Bach knew his music super well. But then also this deeply French influence. And when I was kind of studying and practicing, I sort of thought to myself, you know, what is this French influence? Conceptually, I understand it. I understand that Bach knows about French music. That's very obvious. But what does it mean for a performer in the 1720s or 1730s to understand the French side of his character? And how do we bring that clearly to the fore in music that is undoubtedly French in its quality and character from a compositional perspective? But what does that mean for the performance practice? And so there's this comment in the obituary of 1754 where it's said that Bach had contact with the court musicians in Cello and that he apparently went to Celle and heard the court orchestra there, and that was a hugely influential time for him in the sense that he was getting first-hand knowledge of what it meant to dance French music with a French-inspired dance court orchestra at this provincial court in Celle. And I think it's super important to remember that in the first part of the 18th century, these German courts were trying desperately to emulate Versailles. I mean, there's only one court in the world that everyone wants to match, and that is Versailles and Louis XIV, Louis XIV. And, you know, Louis is still alive until 1715. I mean, this is like serious political influence. Germany is kind of ravaged after the 30 Years' War. They're desperate to come up with a way to sort of ennoble themselves, like bring up goodwill, civility, sophistication, a sense of, what did I write here? I just don't want to forget it because I read it somewhere and it was so good. Yeah, you know, the kind of enhancement of moral sophistication, civility, and gracious behavior. So if you can imagine, Celle set up this orchestra in 1666, and it's completely modeled after Lully, essentially. They have a dancing master who's in charge of the orchestra, who leads the orchestra from the violin, and the entire court is kind of tied up in this idea of learning how to dance and perform French dance music, and actually dance to it, because I think dancing and ballet becomes the emblem of late 17th century French sophistication for German courts. Let me fast forward a bit. So apparently Bach goes to Celle. That might not be true, but he certainly heard this orchestra, and he comes into contact with the dancing master there. And I think it's important because what it means is that it's not a kind of abstract or conceptual thing. Bach is actually hearing a kind of Lullian court orchestra playing gavottes and minuets and bourrées and all of this stuff. He's actually hearing it. He's hearing, crucially, the performance practice of this. He's also hearing keyboard music by François Couperin, maybe even Louis Couperin, Dangelberg, maybe even Freiburger. So this guy who's 15, Bach, or 17, between those ages, he's at school, he's hearing the kind of super posh students at the Ritter Academy speaking French. So he's going, man alive, I need to understand that the language of sophistication is French at this time in the 18th century. Mm-hmm. They all spoke French at school, and he probably kind of learned as he was going along. So that is in a nutshell, just to say, I'm keeping an eye on the time because I can get going, that he has an intimate knowledge of French performance practice, I think. He's hearing inequality, inégalité. He's hearing approaches to rhythmic alteration. He's hearing the sonority of French string playing inspired. This is all going into his brain, combined then with the rigor of kind of North German kind of stilus fantasticus, like Buxtehude, composers like that, Reinken, Georg Böhm. But all of this is going into his kind of DNA and musical psyche at this time. So then you kind of fast forward, I think, to Köthen, where there's also a strong French influence in a way. But then I like to think of it as Bach has this kind of canvas of possibility that he draws from all the time, stylistically and performance practice-wise. And then he comes to something like the C minor suite, and he says, okay, how do I evoke the grandeur and nobility of the French style? And how can I map this idea, which is rather astonishing, onto ostensibly a genre or a style that is totally at odds with that? So he says, I'll choose C minor and I'll compose it for the solo cello. But the worlds of evocation here, I think, are just remarkably rich. Let me just pause for a second and think about what I'm saying. Does that make sense so far, Jean-Guihen?
That's absolutely fantastic. This is so inspiring, dear Chris. This is so inspiring. This is wonderful.
You know, what he says to himself is a few things. And in many ways, the C minor suite is a kind of prototype in his mind for what he's going to do later in about, let's say, 10 years, or maybe even 7 years. And I think when I was researching this piece, the thing that is so important about this Allemande, and which I think is the key to a successful performance of it, which is exactly what you mentioned before, and is exactly how you play it as well. This is not the kind of simple, free-flowing Allemande that we see in some of the other suites. This is, in my opinion, a prototypical French Allemand grave. And that is a kind of tradition of Allemande that sort of blurs the line between the tradition of the Allemande and a very slow preludio, in a sense. I mean, you see these in Freiburger, and you see them in Louis Couperin, and also in Louis Marchand as well. And Bach had all of this music in his library, and he has copies of this stuff. It's harmonically quite daring, this Allemande, but I think the key to it is a few things. The first one is the overture in the French style that Bach writes for the Klavierübung. Now, it wasn't actually designed for that, but he wrote it, well, it probably was. He wrote it first in C minor, interestingly enough, in sort of 1733. And then he revised it in B minor to include in the second part of the Klavierübung in 1735. And it's really fascinating because in the C minor version, like the Allemande of the cello suite, all the flowing notes, the semiquavers, are notated just like that, as semiquavers. Mm-hmm. But in the B minor version, 2 years later, they're all notated as demi-semiquavers, or even faster sometimes, which is exactly how you play those notes at the beginning of this session, which I completely agree with. Totally. Oh God, there's so much to discuss. Now, the other thing is, I think somehow Bach comes up with this idea when writing this Allemande, and also the prelude, that he wants to evoke the world of the viol. And I think that is so key to understanding this piece, the C minor, the whole piece, in a sense. Because I think what he's doing is he's kind of, it's a little bit like how can I put this, like a Matthew Passion Komm süßes Kreuz with training wheels on it. Like in 1717 in Cöthen, or between that time and 23, he's thinking, okay, I want to write in the French style with dotted rhythms, but there's more to it than that. I think what he's saying is, when he gets to the Matthew Passion and pieces like Las Fürsten, BWV 198, which are late 1720s, he writes for the viol in those pieces. And it's so obvious in the research that the viol is this representation of the most aristocratic, regal, and crucially courtly music that you can write. And I think that goes hand in hand with a couple of other things. The first is that Louis XIV played the viol and was quite a renowned viol player. All the paintings of the time with Louis have a viol in the corner. You know, the viol was this symbol of courtly sophistication. Mm-hmm. So then Bach does two things. He says, let me write for the viol, like in Komm süßes Kreuz, but let me also feature prominent dotted rhythms as another kind of tapping of the hat to the French style. And I think all of that is kind of in training in this Allemande of the C minor suite. Mm-hmm. So let me just make sure I'm not forgetting things. Oh, the other thing is, if Bach is writing with the viol in mind as a kind of conceptual aesthetic space in this C minor suite, then it also means that he's evoking these sort of pasted on narratives that we have in those pieces that have viol in them, like this very Lutheran idea of redemption through suffering, of grief and mourning, mm-hmm. of this amazing German word that I never knew before today, of Sündenerkenntnis, this idea of the recognition of sin and the owning of sin. It's not death, it's a delight in the process of healing and of owning up to the frailty of the human being and of sin and all of this stuff. I mean, it's such a deeply Lutheran tenet. Mm-hmm. And I think the viol comes to represent this let's say, viol and dotted rhythms. They all represent this kind of symbolism very clearly. And Bach is setting this up so much in the C minor Allemande. Is that helpful?
Absolutely, it's fantastic, and I think it's. I mean, we should play this Allemande like if we were playing the viol.
I think that's true. And you know what I think is crucial about it, Jean-Guihen, is if you look at the lute version. That was the thing I wanted to say. You know what I mentioned before about the overture in the French style, BWV 831. It exists in these two versions, and it's very clear from the scholarly observations that Bach is revising his performance practice idea of these little notes, the semiquavers. He revises that in the 1730s. He rewrites the piece in B minor, and he takes the time to notate ta-dam, tiga-da-gum, beep, that those are fast notes. So I think he's either thinking one of two things: A, people don't know how to play the semiquavers when they're notated straight, or he wants to. So yes, he wants to make sure that people play it the right way. Possibly, it could be chicken and egg. It might go in the other direction. But, I think with this Allemande, the trick is to find a tempo that's not too fast, actually. I think from the lute version of this piece, it's very clear that he has a very rich conception of what happens between the beats. For example, there are places like, let me see if I can find one of them, where Bach will do things like this. So, like that place that you played close to the end of the A section, where we're going ostensibly to E flat major, Bach will do things like dum, bi-da-da-dim, bi-da-dum, bi-dum. He'll fill in steps of a third. That's bar 12, for example. He'll fill in steps of a third with demi-semiquavers. And I think the whole character of this Allemande needs to have this very interior, soulful, and I think quite a lot slower than what one would imagine in a piece like this. I think this is the kind of overdotting that has nothing to do with the public atmosphere of the French overture. And this is a curious piece because the prelude is one of those weird pieces that is simultaneously evoking the world of the French orchestral overture, but also in this super dark choice of C minor with octaves, you know, C octaves, and with the scordatura allowing you to play G octaves as well. So like with everything with Bach, it's four or five things at the same time. It's a kind of evocation of the French overture, but it's also like trapped in some kind of dungeon in a sense. It needs to be very interior and very personal and private. And that, I think, is also the key to this Allemande, that it needs to have this very, almost as if you're playing for yourself, and slow and very, almost improvisatory, I think. I think the fact that Bach found it suitable for the lute means that we should look to the Allemandes of the Weiss lute suites, which are incredibly long and kind of very much on the slow end of the spectrum, very dreamy, very searching, as if you're playing Komm süßes Kreuz from the Matthew Passion, but without any continuo and no singer, just a kind of very soulful, searching music in a sense. I'm gonna have a sip of my gin and tonic.
Yeah. Wonderful. Oh, that's, you know, it's so amazing listening to you, Chris. I want to, when we hang up, I want to go to my cello and try this Allemande much slower and try to find everything you've talked about. Well, that was so fascinating. Unfortunately, we approach the end of our. Maybe I want to try, and please contradict me and tell me why I'm wrong. This thing about these slurred over notes followed by the faster notes, where you said this French overture where there are two versions. The first version, earlier version with semiquavers, and the second version with he writes the same music with demi semiquavers.
Yes.
Couldn't one say also that? As you said, he might have observed that people would stubbornly play semiquavers when they saw the first version, and he was very annoyed by it, and then he had to put demi semiquavers. But could it be that what we have to find is this organic flow that makes sense, that follows the voice, that follows the going out of the note, and that it's neither strictly semiquavers, neither strictly demi semiquavers. And I want to just bring in connection with this something that came to my mind in his double concerto. György Kurtag, there's this wonderful, that I don't know if you have played this for piano, cello, and two orchestras. An incredible piece, an homage to Beethoven. And there is this one motif that goes, very Hungarian motif, that goes through the whole piece, which is this tatam, this short, long thing, very, very Hungarian. It goes through the whole piece, but in many different tempi, depending on where in the piece it comes. And then depending on that, he has to put it sometimes 16th note, dotted 8th note. Sorry, I'm talking now in this horrible or other language, because the other one is too much work for me. Or sometimes at some places he would put 32nd note and double dotted 8th note. But although it's obvious that he wants this motif to have its own logic independently of the pulse we are in.
Absolutely.
Does that can you agree with that? Or?
I completely agree with that.
Make me so happy. Makes me
absolutely.
So happy.
And the thing about it is exactly what you say is right, in the sense that sometimes we have to find a way to play over-dotted music a little bit less over-dotted than we might normally. And that's actually very hard to do, I find. And as you say so well, it's a lot of a technical issue with feeling that one is in the right part of the bow, and that moment after the dotted note of recapturing, doing justice to the silence, but also keeping the shape of the long note intact. And I think exactly that about this Allemande, that the overdotting shouldn't be too aggressively overdotted. Yeah. But of course, as you say, that's also a big question of what the tempo is. And it's a shame that Bach doesn't fuss a little bit more about that, because I think this really is an Allemande grave in the tradition of like the Allemande in the D major keyboard partita. This is very slowly unfolding music. There's no kind of, I don't think this is one of those Allemandes that has the sort of jagged edges that we might see in it. I think it's much more, also, if you slow it down a little bit, there's a chance to play those a little more inegal and not dotted so much. And this is also another issue that I think Bach addresses with this piece, is knowing what it means to play 3+1 or just slightly inegal. The difference between tam, tadim, papim, and shim, pibim, shirim, which is this sort of slightly creamier, more chocolatey overdotting that Francois Couperin describes, every one of these people describes being in total control of how to play dotted rhythms. And I think that's really what this Allemande is about, is a kind of masterclass in that.
Thank you so much, dear Chris. What a privileged moment to have you here for taking the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody, Merry Christmas, best possible end of the year, stay healthy, and as they say here in Germany, guten Rutsch, into the new year, and see you beginning of January for the rest of the Bach suites. Bye-bye, Chris.